Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum. Welcome to the third lecture of the course Management Organizational Policies and Practices. Before we start with today's lecture, I would again like to have a recap of the second lecture of the course, which was on strategy development and the different processes of strategy development and the managerial implications of the different strategy development processes and the forms of strategy. The first one, we started with the discussion of the intended strategy development processes, and we discussed 4 different processes or 4 different alternative explanations to how the intended strategy of an organization develops and emerges. So the first one was the strategic planning, in which the planning is entirely top-down, and it is a very formalized exercise, and they are written down documents which and all the policies and all the analysis that are being carried out from the external environment, and with the help of the managers of the company, a corporate plan document emerges, and there are strict evaluations and controls of the plan that has been made at the corporate unit, which has to be exercised by the strategic business units at all levels. Then we also discussed the option of strategy. Also discussed the strategic workshops, which is another alternate process of intended strategy development. In this concept, in the strategy workshops, what happens is that the various managers and even the external consultants, and in some cases also the low-level employees and the top-level employees, they gather together and they discuss different options vis-a-vis the objectives of the workshop. So there can be a number of objectives of the workshop, such as there can be discussions on how the resistance to change can be minimized, how the strategy can be implemented more successfully. You need to evaluate your strategy, and for that you're organizing a workshop. You need to challenge the assumptions of your existing strategy, and for that you're carrying out the workshop and gathering all the experts in the area and the managers and the consultants, etc., and sending your recommendations to the top management. And you can also carry on such workshops to do your development of the strategy exercise, or revisiting the intended strategy exercise. Right, and then you can also have take the opinion of the external consultants for the intended strategy development, because the external consultants are the people who come to the organization, who give their opinion to the organization with a fresh eye, and they're also the carriers of knowledge. They're the experts in the field of the strategy development. That is why they can help the organization by giving an unbiased opinion, and they can prioritize, analyze the different strategic options available to the organization by scanning the environment in a better way. Then we have the externally imposed strategy, that is another alternate process to intended strategy development. We discussed that externally imposed strategies can be faced by different organizations, such as the governmental organizations, where lots of restrictions are imposed by the government. Right, and for example, the government privatizing any public sector companies, such in the case of Pakistan, we can take the example of PTCL, right? And so this opinion of strategy says that intended strategy develops as a result of the impositions that are by the external factors which are outside the control of the organization. They lead to the development of the strategy. Then we discussed that emergent strategy development processes, and we saw that emergent strategy is the strategy which comes out of logical incrementalism, resource allocation routines, cultural processes, and political processes. So there can be one of these processes involved in the development of emergent strategy, or these all can be involved simultaneously to some levels, to some degrees. Logical incrementalism said that the organization is responding very incrementally to the changes taking place in the external environment. So it is learning through partial commitments, it is learning through experimentation, and it is responding to those small changes, and that is how the strategy is emerging at the shop floor, basically. And the resource allocation routines told that the company allocates the resources in the strategic direction which it wants to take. So for example, if it wants to take the market development direction, then it will be allocating more resources towards the projects which are for entering the new markets. And if it wants the new product development, then it will be allocating more resources which are designed to cater to the new product development. And then we have the cultural processes. Cultural processes, they again, cultural processes also is an explanation for emergent strategy development, because the culture in the organization can provide a strong resistance to change, and the managers, fearing that resistance to change, maybe they are, even if they have to bring some minor changes or some changes in the strategy in response to the external environment, they try to bring those changes which are in line with the existing business or existing cultural dimensions of the organization, so that they don't have to face the resistance from the external environment. So it is the culture of the organization that is largely dictating the strategy of the organization, as per this view, or as per this point. And then we have the political processes. Political processes say that there are the top leaders, they have their own political agendas, they have their own political motives, their own vested interests, which lead them to the development of the organizational strategy. Then we discussed the concept of strategic drift, which was that how the organizations, they progressively fail when they are unable to keep pace with the changes in the external environment. So they are not as much responsive to the changes in the external environment. They are basically reactive to the changes in the external environment. They are not proactive to those changes. And then we saw that learning organization can provide an answer to the dilemma of strategic drift. How the organizations can keep them from falling in strategic drift by learning ways of learning organization. The managers, they need to create environment in the organization which is very conducive for knowledge sharing, so that the employees can share their explicit and implicit knowledge with each other, which can give them way, which can give them room for more thinking, for better thinking, for challenging the existing assumptions, for looking out into the market, for thinking out of the box. And with the help of these social networks, with the help of this sharing of knowledge, they can bring in more new ideas, fresh ideas to the organization. Those ideas can be assimilated in the organization, and they can become the part of the organizational memory. That is the concept of learning organization. Then we also discussed the concept of multiple strategy development processes, and we saw that the different processes, the different alternative explanations to strategy development, may it be intended strategy development, may it be emergent strategy development, these processes, they are not mutually exclusive. Those processes, they can coexist simultaneously. For example, even if the strategy is being developed, it is very, very planned and top-down exercise, and it is developed after a very consuming a very long time. Even then, that does not mean that that strategy does not involve any political or cultural processes into it. There still might be some political incentives, political initiatives that might have led to the development of that strategy in a planned way, but in a political way as well. So all those processes, they can coexist, maybe to the different levels, one process at a lower level or not with that much magnitude, but and the other process at a higher level and with bigger magnitude. But those processes, they can exist side by side. Similarly, at the stage of the development of the strategy, a company may be simultaneously taking the help of external consultants, although it's doing it in a planned way, following the steps which strategic planning follows, but also with the help of the external consultants. Then we have the, we all discussed in the end, the last section of this lecture was on vision and mission statements of the organization. We discussed that what is a mission statement of the organization, which was that where it wants to see itself in the future, and the mission statement, that how it plans to reach there. We also discussed the important components of these statements, the importance of these statements, And we also discussed a few examples of these statements, and we saw that how making an effective vision and mission statement can lead an organization to higher performance, can lead better returns to financial measures, because it can, vision and mission statement of a company is basically conveying the company's reason of existence to all the stakeholders that are involved in the company. So it can be a very crucial statement which can be very which can attract the emotional attachment of the different stakeholders towards the organization. Okay, so these were all the different components that we discussed in detail in the second lecture. Today we are going to talk about the external environment of the company and the implications of for the management or for the managers of the organization from the external environment, how the management should respond to the external environment, what are the implications of the external environment for the management of the organization. So what you can expect from today's lecture is, after hearing this lecture, you should be able to analyze the broad macro environment of the organization in terms of political, economic, social, technological, environmental and legal factors. Then identify key drivers in this macro environment and use these key drivers to construct alternative scenarios with regard to environmental change. You should be also able to use 5 forces analysis in order to determine the attractiveness of industries and sectors for investment and to identify their potential for change. And then you should also be able to identify strategic groups, market segments, critical success factors, and use them in order to recognize strategic gaps and opportunities in the market. Okay, so what is external environment and why we need to carry on an external assessment? Let's start with a very enforcing statement by Charles Darwin. Charles Darwin said that it's not the strongest of the species that survive, nor the most intelligent, but the one most responsive to change. So the statement is very powerful and it says it all. We have another statement by the former CEO of PepsiCo, Wayne Calloway. He says that nothing focuses the mind better than the constant sight of a competitor who wants to wipe you off the map. So from these two statements, we can very well see that importance of analyzing, scanning the external environment cannot be overestimated. It is your competitors who will wipe you off the business if you will not continuously search out what is happening in the external market, what are the changes taking place in the external market, what are the steps, what are the moves of your competitors, and how you have to respond to those moves. If you're not constantly watch out on these, you'll be wiped off the market. And also, it is not important whether you are the strongest or not, whether you are the most intelligent or not, but what is important is that you need to be responsive to change. So if a firm gains competitive advantage, and if it is very strong at one time, it is market leader at one time, it does not mean that it will remain the market leader for the next several years to come. We cannot be certain because the external environment is very uncertain and it is very ambiguous. So to maintain that competitive advantage, to sustain that competitive advantage, the firm constantly needs to watch out and scan its external environment and respond accordingly. So we'll be discussing all these points in detail in our upcoming slides. So what is the purpose of an external assessment or an external audit? It is to develop a list, and that list should be finite. Develop a finite list of opportunities that could benefit a firm, and it could also develop a list of those threats that the firm needs to avoid. We have the industrial organizational view, which was given by Michael Porter, and it came up in 1960s and it remained through till 1980s. It was till the view basically says that you need to emphasize on your external environment for staying competitive and surviving in the industry. So for the survival of the organization, it needs to scan the external environment. That was the view given by Michael Porter through the industrial organizational view. Opposed to this view is an internal view of the firm, which says that the firm needs to focus really on the internal strengths and weaknesses of the company. So out of the 4 elements of the SWOT analysis, these views are basically divided in 2 elements each. So SWOT analysis, as you would be familiar with, it stands for strengths, weaknesses, opportunities and threats. So the industrial organizational view basically is focusing on opportunities and threat part of the SWOT analysis. It says that a firm needs to really emphasize on that part to stay competitive. And the internal assessment view says that you need to emphasize on your strengths and on your weaknesses, because the opportunities and threats, the opportunities that are for one firm, they can easily be imitated by the other firms. If you have some physical resources, if you have some machinery, if you have some technology that is really advanced, it can be easily copied by your competitors. But as opposed to that, the internal assessment view says that you need to focus on your own company's own strengths and weaknesses in terms of its human resources and in terms of its human capital. So they are the main asset for the company, which is not imitable. So if you have that asset and that is providing competitive advantage, that cannot be easily imitated by your competitors. So we'll be discussing the internal assessment view, that is, we'll be discussing the strengths and weaknesses part in our next lecture. And for this lecture, we'll be concentrating on the industrial organizational view, which is basically emphasizes the threats and the opportunities from the external environment that are available to the organization and how the organization should respond to those. An organization or a company basically, or a firm, it is basically faced with 3 layers when it comes to its external environment or when it comes to the business environment. So the outermost layer is the macro environment of the organization. It is also termed as the general environment of the organization. This macro environment of the organization is basically the different segments in that the organization has to deal with in the macro environment, and it would be explained with the help of PESTEL framework in our upcoming slides. Then we have the industry environment, which is the inner layer of the environment that the organization is facing. So this is the industry in which the organization is competing. We'll be explaining this industry or the sector as the inner layer of the environment that the organization is facing with the help of the 5 forces model. Then we have the direct competitors, that is the innermost layer or the innermost environment that the organization has, right? So the competitors are the direct competitors of the organization. They'll be explained with the help of strategic group in our upcoming slides. Okay, so let's first see the outermost layer of the environment of the organization, that is the macro environment or the general environment, which, as we told you, will be explained with the help of PESTEL, with the help of scenarios and the key drivers of change. We'll be studying these 3 aspects in the upcoming slides, and then we'll be moving to the inner layer of the environment, which is the industry. So PESTEL framework. What is the PESTEL framework? So as the name indicates, it's basically PESTEL framework provides 6 different segments, which are the main segments that are affecting the organization in the macro environment. And these, as the P of PESTEL stands for political, E is for economic, S is for social, T is for technological, E is for environmental, and L is for legal. So as per this framework, these are the 6 different segments in the macro environment that are affecting the organization. How these different segments are affecting the organization, I have a few small examples for you, for your better understanding that how these different segments can affect an organization and how the effects can be different in different ways, in different contexts, and for different organizations. So for some organizations, these segments can have very macro effects of very high magnitude, and for some organizations they may not have that much huge effects, and for some organizations they may have no effect at all. And for some organizations, they may have so huge impacts that they become the threats to their existence, threats to their survival, right? So when we discuss all these aspects, all these segments in detail vis-a-vis their effects on the organization, we'll be also at the end we'll be also be seeing their implications for the management, and it will become more clear to you. So let's start with the demographic segment. Demographic segment is basically how the demographic composition is changing in the macro environment of the organization. So there is phenomenon of graying population, for example. There are more and more white people in the labor force now than they used to be in the past. That is also because life expectancy is increasing and people are expected to live in around 100 or 200 years in the US in the years to come. So implications of this for the workforce is that there is aged workforce in the work groups, aged people in the work groups, and people of up to 60 or 70 years of age. They have increased from 4% to 7% over the last decades. So by 2015, it is expected that 18.5% of the population would be higher than 65 years of age. So you see that it's a very large proportion of people that would be older in the population. So what kind of threats or what kind of opportunities does it pose for the organization? There can be numerous opportunities for the firms. And I have an example of GlaxoSmithKline, GSK here, how it responds to this change in the demographic proportion or in the demographic segment of the macro environment. What it is doing is that it is providing drugs to the elderly people at 25% discounts. So what are the implications of that? Implications are that it is increasing its sales and services to important class of people. Why is that important class of people? Because their proportion is really significantly increasing. So it is providing 25% discount to that class, and as a result of that, it is increasing its sales and it is increasing its profitability. Right. So other implications for the organizations can be that as a result of the increase in the graying population into the labor force, there might be changes in the pension plans. So there are other implications that the organization must need to keep in mind. Also, we have the change in the ethnic mix, such as we have less whites, and it is expected that by 2075 there will be no ethnic or racial majority. So you will not be able to say that there are more whites in this organization, there is majority of whites, or there is majority of blacks in this organization. There will be so much diverse workforce. Then people are increasingly moving from non-metropolitan to metropolitan areas. It again has some implications for both the industrial and for both the agricultural sector, such as in the non-metropolitan areas now there are lesser and lesser labor force available. So the cost of labor is increasing there. There is increasingly mechanization of agriculture there. Agriculture is becoming more automized, more automated, and then we also have the implications for the industry here, such as we have the societal challenges also here, number of homes, the overpopulation in the metropolitan areas, right? Pollution in the metropolitan areas is also an outcome. Okay, and then we have the workforce diversity. As we discussed earlier, that the workforce is increasingly getting more and more diverse. There is heterogeneity in the workforce. There are more and more work teams. The work teams are heterogeneous. The people are coming from different varied backgrounds. And as a result of that, the organization needs to have more innovative and more effective strategies to deal with those heterogeneous work groups, because otherwise diversity can also lead to conflicts, and the organization needs to have the strategies with which the conflicts between the team members, if they arise, they can be minimized. So for example, if there is conflict arising within a team, what the organization can do is that it can make the job rotations of the employees or of the team members from one team to the other, so that they are in good liaison, they keep in good liaison with each other, and so on. There can be a number of strategies which the firm can adopt to resolve the conflict, and we'll be discussing all those conflict management strategies in one of our lectures in future. Then we have the economic segment. A number of factors in the economic segment can affect the organization, can affect the products of the organization, can affect the customers of the organization by affecting the purchasing power of the people, such as the change in the interest rates, change in the monetary policy of the organization, change in the inflation rates in the organization. They can directly affect the buying power of the customers, of the people, and they can directly affect the income levels of the people. They can directly affect the purchasing power of the people, and thus they can affect the organization directly. Then we also know that the nations throughout the world, how they have been affected by the Chinese economy. Chinese, they're basically very good followers. So whenever there is a new technology, whenever there is a new innovation taking place in the advanced countries such as in USA or in Europe, what Chinese are doing is that they're immediately following that. They're immediately adapting to that technology and immediately producing the products at much cheaper rates than they are being produced there by adopting this follower strategy. And they have really basically captured the whole world market by producing goods at a much cheaper rates which are available anywhere around the globe. So the goods, and then they are doing this price discrimination. The goods are more cheap in the Chinese goods are more cheap in the Pakistani markets, and they are relatively expensive in the US market. So they are very intelligently, very strategically doing their business, and they are that is how they have captured the world market, and they are a threat to the advanced countries, even to the economies of the advanced nations even. And then we have the how the effects. We also need to look at how the 9/11 affected the bilateral trade between the US and the other countries of the world. How the US imposed sanctions of the developing countries of the world, how it imposed sanctions on Pakistan, right? And it affected the bilateral trade, right? So as a result of that, when it is affecting the bilateral trade, it is imposing sanctions, and you cannot make as much exports as you were doing earlier, and you are working in the industry which is directly hitting the exports, and sanctions are imposed on your products, and you cannot make as much exports as you were doing earlier. And what is happening is here is that your organization, your company, your industry is being affected by the changes, economic changes in taking place in the macro environment. The global changes that took place, how directly they're affecting your organization. Then we have the political segment. Here what's happening is that the privatization of the state-owned firms, for example, so the policies that are taking place by the government in a country, how they can affect your organization, your firm. There can be changes in the taxation laws, there can be changes in the trading laws that can affect the industries and the firms, right? So such as the most favored nation status thing, how it affects what implications it has for the firms in Pakistan. Then protectionism policies by the government and the free trade. There is a huge debate on whether the firms in the developing countries, they should be protected, and how the world trade order, free trade regime is going to affect the developing countries. Is it fair for the developing countries? Would they be able to compete with the developed nations of the world if they are not, if their industries, if their infant industry is not protected? So the governments can adopt different policies, such as they can the protectionist policies for the infant industries of the country to promote them, and so that they are developed and they become able to compete with the external world, or the free trade. So these are all the different policies that can affect the organization directly. And then IFM basically describes the free trade as when the tariffs are lower than 9%, then it comes in the free trade regime. And when the barriers, they are above the 25% of the product price, then they are really restrictive. So firms, they develop their political strategies as well, and they must develop their political strategies as well, keeping in view, I've given you a few examples that how the governmental policies, the governmental strategies, they can affect the organization directly, their protectionism policies, their tax laws, their trading laws, etc., how they can affect the companies directly. So they must have some regulations, they must have some their own political strategies on how they have to respond to the varying regulations imposed by the government. Then we have the socio-cultural segment, which is concerned with the society's attitudes and cultural values. What is happening here is that basically we can see that there is increasingly dual career couples, means that husband and wife both are working. More and more proportion of women we can see in the jobs nowadays, in the businesses nowadays. And then there is continuing growth of contingency workers. Why is that? That is happening because the promise of lifelong employment is increasingly eroding, right? Because of the flexibility pressures, on the organizations from around the globe. As a result of globalization, organizations can no longer offer the lifetime employment which was previously there for the employees. So the organizations are increasingly hiring the part-time workers, they're increasingly hiring the contingency workers. So they're in order to attain more and more flexibility, right? So the flexibility, either they can achieve the flexibility by keeping the number of labor in the organization lower and hiring other workers from the external labor market on temporary basis, temp workers, which we also call. They hire those temp workers, and when their market or their product market, it is in boom, when there is more need for their products, or when the demand for their products increases, they can really hire those temp workers or the agency workers, right? And they can get their need fulfilled. And so for a shorter period of time, they hire those workers, and then when again the demand for their product falls, then and the contract for those workers is also expired, and this is giving the organization the flexibility, right? So also alternately, the organization can take over work from its existing employees when the demand for their product rises, and it can pay them more and remain flexible. Then we have the technological segment. How the technological segment is affecting the organization, how the technological environment is affecting the organization. So we know that there is very fastly the technology and the technological environment is growing. The rate of obsolescence of the technology is very high. It has resulted in the shorter and shorter life cycles than ever before, right? Product life cycles are shortening. Those organizations which were once market leaders, or which were really technologically advanced and which were really in the mature stages of their product development, even those organizations have to face challenges. They really have to fight to maintain their market share and to maintain their market leader status, because of the shortening of the product life cycles and because of the speed with which the technology is getting obsolete, right? So the rate of obsolescence is very high. When you are in the developing country, you also have the implications as to the rate of the transfer of technology. What are the government's what is the government's strategy vis-a-vis the transfer of technology? That is really important. So here there is interplay of two segments. One is the political segment and the other one is the technological segment. Then also it is important that how much weightage the government is giving to research. So research is of course directly related to the development of technology, right? How much expenditures it is doing on the research, and how much expenditures or budget it is allocating towards research, right? That is really important. Then we also know that we see that as a result of the advancement in the technology, there are already effects on the agriculture. As we discussed earlier, it is more and more mechanized. There is labor capital ratio is really declining. There is more capital employed, the more machinery is employed, right? And the people, their role now is the concept of manual labor is basically decreasing, and the people are more sitting on the machines and more supervising the work which is carried out by the machines, right? And also there is increasingly e-commerce. You can say that all the businesses, they are taking place online. Buying and selling is taking place online. Orders are being placed online, and they are being home deliveries. Then we have the technological segment. Again, we are just discussing the technological segment, and here I have examples of the Chief Information Officer and Chief Technology Officer. These are the new positions which have been emerged as a result of the importance of IT in today's organizational lives, right? We have an example of Sun Microsystems. It's basically one of the very big renowned companies in the world, and they were facing the pressures. They were facing the pressures for their survival, right? And they have different different strategists, they had or different consultants, they had different views on how the company should fight the war of its survival. So the strategists, they had the opinion that they should reduce their costs, they should cut their costs because of the economic downturn. The company should also cut down its costs, right? And it should also do some restructuring, while the CEO of the company, it believed that it should invest heavily in that research and development for its survival. So here we can see that there are, what the point that I'm trying to make here is that different specialists, different strategists, different consultants, they can have different opinions on how to deal with a certain situation, right? Or how to prioritize your strategic options, right? And what are the strategic options available to you, how you analyze your options, right? And how you prioritize them. This can be really subjective, right? Because of there is uncertainty in the environment, and you get different specialists, they can respond to that uncertainty in different ways. So here I am giving you two opinions vis-a-vis a company that was troubled as opposed to the downturn in the economy. The company had to face pressures, and we have two very opposing opinions from the consultant and from the CEO of the company. One wants the company to really divest and retrench, and the other wants the company to really spend heavily in its R&D. So what are the key drivers of change in the macro environment? Market globalization. There is basically the markets are globalized, right? So there is convergence of consumer needs, there is convergence of lifestyles, and there is convergence of patterns. We have example of the soft drinks. Increasingly all over the world there is increased demand of soft drinks, whether you are in the developing countries or you are in the developed countries. Similarly, you can see that jeans, which was once really restricted to some parts of the world, it is now increasingly worn by in all over the world. So the demand is increasing for it all over which is showing that there is convergence of the tastes, of the lifestyles of the customers. There is convergence there, right? And then again we have the electrical items such as audio equipment, etc., that is increasingly being utilized all over the globe. Customers' demands and the customer needs are converging, right? And we can see McDonald's as an example of the convergence of tastes of the customers, how the McDonald's has its existence worldwide. Now we were discussing the lifestyles, we were discussing the jeans. We can also see that Marks and Spencer, how it is existing worldwide, right? And then we have the global operators, we have global markets which are driven by international distributors, there are international suppliers, and there is global distribution channels, right? So they are all the drivers for this market globalization, right? The convergence of taste, the convergence of the needs and the lifestyles of the customers, it is the driver of the market globalization. And then we have the cost globalization, which is another driver of change. So under cost globalization, what is happening is that basically the industries, they are, whether the industrial strategy is low cost or whether the industrial strategy is differentiation, whatever the industrial strategy is, nowadays because of the customers, they are really aware. The customers are global. How? Because online they can purchase anything from any part of the world. They are very well aware of the pricing of the product offered by one company vis-a-vis the other companies, right? So they can make very smart decisions, they can make very informed choices, right? As a result of that, the industries, they are trying to lower their costs, attract more customers, and in an effort to do that, the industries are increasingly opening their manufacturing facilities, they're opening their operations in the low-cost countries. They're moving to the low-cost countries, such as we have the example of Nike. It is opening its manufacturing operations in the developing countries, such as in India. It is opening its manufacturing. It is doing the manufacturing, right? And Then we have the example of Coca-Cola. It has established its manufacturing plants in China. A huge amount of manufacturing plants it's establishing in China. So why is that? Because these countries are we have a huge amount of call centers are being established in India and China as well. So again, and other IT facilities are really growing in India because of the fact that India and China, they have huge amounts of labor, and which is very cheaply available, right? And these countries, these industries, they want to benefit from that cheap labor. They want to reduce their total cost there by getting the things at very low labor price. So it has the implications for the organizations, those organizations who are the competitors of the organizations who are bringing their operations outside and producing cheaply. It has the implication for the organization who is producing at home. They also want to go abroad and produce cheaply in order to compete with their competitors, right? Otherwise they will be it will be difficult for them to survive, right? So this is so they're also in that attempt, they're also trying to do what their competitor is doing. This is the implications that it has for the cost for the macro for the organization. Then we have the technical standardization, which is as we discussed about the World Trade Order, right? So what is World Trade Order doing is that it is technically standardizing the bringing technical standardization in the around the globe by bringing the tariffs to a lower than this much percentage for all countries. It has implications for all countries, and it is technically standardizing the bringing standardization in all the countries. So what is a scenario? Scenarios, they are the detailed and plausible views of how the business environment of an organization might develop in the future based on key drivers for change about which there is high level of uncertainty. We just saw that, we just saw in our previous slides the different segments in the macro environment that are affecting the organization. We also discussed the key drivers of change, right? And we see that the external environment is uncertain, and how those factors in the macro environment can change alone. One factor can change alone, or they can change in combination with each other, and they can have differential effect on different organizations, different industries, and different sectors. What the organization needs to do is that it needs to do the scenario building. Scenario building is done to cope with the changes in the external environment. When it is highly uncertain, the managers, what they need to do is that they need to build several scenarios, that if this change takes place in the political environment, if the government raises the tax by this much percentage, right, and if you have the trade restrictions, impositions, right, by this much, right, then how you are going to respond under this scenario, how you are going to respond, right? If there is change in the educational policy, what are its implications for your organization in terms of the skilled labor that is available to the organization, right? So there can be different plausible scenarios can be built which are most critical to the organization itself. So if, for example, it is a technological organization, if it is an IT company, right, so for it the most critical external environmental factor which can have greater influence is the technological segment, right? What are the changes taking place in the technological market? What is the transfer of speed of the transfer of technology? What is the governmental policies on the vis-a-vis the transfer of technology, right? How much it is spending on the research, how much research grants it is giving, right? So all those factors would be more important in the to the technology industry, right? So in which industry, in which context you are operating, and as per that, what are the key main factors in the external environment which can affect your industry, and in what combinations they can affect your industry, right? that you need to build a few scenarios. The scenarios, they should not be innumerable, and the number of factors, they should also not be innumerable. You need to identify key factors, key important factors, and you need to build a few scenarios. After the scenario building, for each scenario you can also build your, and you need to build your contingency plan, that if this scenario emerges, this would be your contingency plan. If this scenario emerges, this would be your contingency plan, right? So this is what scenario building and contingency plan making is. You need to respond to that external environment, to that macro environment, by building the scenarios, right, and doing your contingency planning. So in management implications, some of the implications for the management we discussed previously, and here we see that, of course, the firm, it is too small when it comes to the macro environment. Macro environment is really global. That is not only the country in which you are producing, but it is worldwide. In today's changes that are taking place in front of the World Trade Order, for example. So whole world is your competitor. So the firms, they cannot control the general environment or the macro environment, but the macro environment can really control the firm. It can really challenge the survival of the firm, right? So the firm needs to build and implement the strategies which are very well in line with the general environment. Then the retailers, for example, they're more concerned with the consumer taste, so they need to devise their strategies. They need to see how changes in the macro environment as the consumer goods can affect them, right? Then we have the Porter's diamond. Porter's diamond is the certain factors that make some countries more. What Porter did here was that he basically presented this view, this theory, that there are certain countries, certain nations, and the certain sectors within those nations that are more competitive than other nations and the other sectors that are within the country or outside the country. And he gave a few explanations as to how it happens, why certain nations and why certain sectors are more competitive than other nations and other sectors. So his first explanation is that there can be certain legislations or regulations imposed by the government in some country which can lead to the growth of some sector in that country. For example, in Sweden and Japan, they have the policy that you cannot lay off your employees once you have hired the employee. So there is lifetime employment concept, lifetime security, employment security is given to the employees once you hire the employee as per the law of Sweden and Japan, right? So as we discussed earlier, under the era of globalization, where there are challenges to the organizations to remain flexible and respond to the external environment by being highly flexible, it may not be possible for you to stay that flexible when you cannot hire or fire the employee so easily once he is hired, right? Because if there is downturn in the economy and you do not need that much amount of headcount, that much number of headcount, then it increases to your fixed costs and it makes you inflexible, right? So how do these firms, they respond? They have increasingly automated their industries, right? And they have such that they have less and less reliance on labor, so that they do not need to fire the labor in times of need, and they don't need to fire the labor, right? So they're already flexible on that area. They have automated their industries, right? Then there can be certain home demand conditions. For example, Japanese customers, they have always expected very high quality electrical and electronic equipment, which has as a result of that, their electrical and electronic industry, it has really grown. It provided impetus to those industries to grow locally, as well as they gained global dominance because of the home demand conditions. They were so conducive in Japan, right? And you can see today that how the Japanese electrical and electronic equipment is dominating the world market. Then he also has another explanation and says that the related and supporting industries, they can also provide advantage to each other, and they can also provide the impetus of growth to each other by benefiting from each other, such as the Italian leather working machinery industry and the design services industry. They both benefit from each other, mutually benefit from each other, and as a result they grow. It provides them impetus to grow. So the Italian footwear, you know, it's dominating the world again. Then we have the what are the implications? They are that this is how the home conditions, this is how there are certain factors in the nations, in certain sectors, such as the demand for those sectors is so much high. There are so many customers in for certain products in certain sectors that it gives them impetus to grow, and that is how they keep growing and they gain dominance in the world market, right? So competition implications for management is that, and the implications for the country or for the nation is that the competition, it must be encouraged at home. Instead of protecting them, they should be encouraged to compete, right? So the governments can enhance this by setting high standards of product performance, safety and environmental standards, encouraging cooperation between buyers and suppliers on domestic level. Okay, then we have the next layer of the environment, which is the inner layer of the environment that the organization has, that is the industry environment. So what is an industry? Industry basically refers to the group of firms who are competing over close substitutes. So compared to general environment, industry environment has direct effect on firms' strategic competitiveness, right? So as you know, the micro environment, that is the external most layer, they're indirectly affecting the organization, but the general environment or the industry environment, the industries in which a firm is competing, they directly affect the firm and its competitiveness. So if you are in the competitive industry, there are certain industries that are more prone to profits than the other industries. If you're in the competitive industry, your chances for survival and your chances for profit making are higher than you are in industries where the profit margins are not that high. Again, there is a convergence between this industry. As we know that I defined the industry earlier as the industries who are, the firms are supposed to be in one industry when they are producing the similar products, but we see that there is convergence, the boundaries between the industries are blurring as a result of the convergence. Now the car manufacturing industry, for example, car manufacturers, they're also providing the insurance services. So there is convergence. The customers, they can even get their insurance done from the car manufacturing companies, right? Instead of going to the insurance industry. So the boundary is blurring, right? And also the consumers, they are starting to substitute the products such as TVs for PCs. And then e-commerce is again giving new dimensions to manufacturers. Instead of traditional retailing, there are new business models as a result. Concept of traditional distributors, that is eroding. The e-commerce is, the buying and selling is done online. Okay, we have the 5 forces model that explains that how the organization has to face the competition, or has the different factors that are affecting the organization in the external environment or in the industry environment. We have the potential development of substitute products, we have the bargaining power of consumers and that of suppliers, rivalry among the competing firms, and the potential entry of new competitors. Here we see that existing firms, they have the threat of new entrants. Of course, when there are new entrants, they will be competing for the market share, right? And they are a threat for the existing firm, right? But generally, if the firms, especially if they are not really scanning their environment very well, they may not be aware of this threat unless the competitor has entered the market and is a potential danger to the organization. Right, so new firms generally, they enter those industries. Easier for them to enter the industry where the barriers are low. So let's see what the entry barriers are, or what they can be. Economies of scale can be a very big entry barrier. Economies of scale is when you're producing in really large amounts, and as a result of that, your output is very high and your fixed costs per unit costs, they decline, right? And which gives you a margin to sell your products in the market at very lower prices, or you can keep your prices constant and increase your profitability, and you can increase your sales. But normally, generally, what the firms do is that it gives them so much flexibility, producing huge amounts of output at very lower price, that they can sell at very lower prices, and it's difficult for the competitors to compete at that price. So these are the advantages which are normally reaped by the firms who are producing at large scale, with the big firms, right? So it is a entry barrier for the new firms. Then we have the product differentiation as another entry barrier. It can serve another entry barrier for the new entrants. The firms who are competing on the base of the differentiated products in the eyes of the customers, or they have won the loyalty in the eyes of the customers by their very effective advertisements, such as the done by Coca-Cola and PepsiCo. They are really loyal customers, right? So if there is any beverage, any company who wants to enter this beverages industry and wants to compete with Coca-Cola and PepsiCo, it would be really difficult for them to win the customers, because they have gained really strong customer loyalties, right? And then we have establishing value of new products by firm is a challenge, right? So that is an entry barrier for the new firms. Then the capital requirements in some industries can be so high that they themselves serve as the entry barrier for the new industries, such as in the pharmaceutical industries, the capital requirements are very high. In the steel industry, the capital requirements are very high. And then, so you need to have the capital for the physical facilities, for the inventories, for the machineries, which can be very expensive in some of the industries, right? And they serve as a barrier to the entry for the new entrants. And then we have the access to distribution and supplier channels. So for some of the existing firms, they may have very long-term contracts with the suppliers, or they might have developed very long-term and very smooth working relationships. They have won the trust of the suppliers and the other distributors. They have won mutual trust, and they want to carry on with each other. So it might be difficult for the new entrants to make agreements with those suppliers and those distributors who are already serving the competitors for some years now. And then we have the cost advantages that are independent of scale, right? They can also be entry barriers for the firms. For example, if a firm gets the raw material which is available to it at very low cost, and it is working in very strategic and very desirable locations, right? And where as a result of which it is really competitive, right? And then it is also getting the government subsidies. So these can be the cases which can again serve the entry barriers as entry barriers to the competitors or to the new entrants. Then what are the implications for the new entrants? How the new entrants, they can deal with these entry barriers? Of course, this is clear that the small scale entry is very costly, because of course they cannot reap the economies of scale, they cannot produce at that much lower cost, and as a result, if their cost will be higher, it will be difficult for them to enter the market and to capture some market share. So locating some market niche, and that can be a very good option for these firms. And mostly new entrants, what they do is that they start with through this strategy, entering the market niche and then slowly capturing the market. So another option available to them that can be that they can bypass those distributors and the retailers, right? And they can sell directly through e-commerce, through internet, online. They can get their customers and sell there. As we discussed earlier, that the small entrepreneurial firms, they can cater to the ignore market segments, or they can enter by way of entering the niche markets, right? Just as Honda did when it entered the US market. It focused on small engine motorcycles. That is how it entered the US market. It was ignored before, and that is how it well captured the US market. Then we have the bargaining power of suppliers. Supplier power increases. Supplier power, right? How the firm needs to keep an eye on the supplier power and what implications it has for the supplier power. If your suppliers are really in concentration, right, that is, you have very few suppliers, then of course they are in a more powerful and in a more bargaining position than the firm itself is, right? Or alternately, if the suppliers, they are producing the raw material which is really differentiated, and that raw material is making your own product differentiated in the eyes of the customers, and you're competing on the basis of the differentiated products, then that supplier for you is really strategic, right? And as a result, that supplier has higher bargaining power. That supplier becomes more powerful, right? And again, if the supplier is providing the raw material which is very good quality, right, and if you have some agreements, long-term agreements with your supplier, right, then it won't be easier for you to switch the supplier, and the supplier will be in a very good bargaining position, in a very good bargaining power. So these are some of the few examples of how and when a supplier can be very powerful. And if there are lots of suppliers, there is no concentration of the suppliers in the market. If he is not giving you the raw material that is really differentiated, there are a number of suppliers with whom you can enter into agreements, then of course the supplier power will be lower in that case, and you will be more powerful to make your decisions and switch over your suppliers. Then the bargaining power of consumers. Of course, the objective of the firm is it wants to get the highest returns on the capital, but it also have to sell its products to the customers who wants the product at lower price and with better quality and better services, right? So when are the customers powerful of an organization? Of course, the customers are powerful again when they are in concentration. When there are fewer customers for your product and you have heavy reliance on those customers, then of course they are powerful. So they are purchasing bigger portion of your total output. As I told you earlier, that the customers nowadays through e-commerce and through increased internet buying and sellings, they're very well aware. They can make very informed choices. So if your product is such that it is not differentiated and it is being offered by a number of other competitors, or there are many substitutes available for your product, then of course your customer is more powerful. The customer can easily switch over to some other products offered by the other competitors, right? So unless and until your product is differentiated, it might be easier for your customer to switch. Or if your customer is not very loyal to the product, long-term loyalty has not been established with the customer, then also it's easier for the customer to switch. Then we have the threat of substitute products that are there to the organization. An organization might be facing the threats for the production of the substitute products, right? Substitute products threats is normally high when your product price is either very high or your product quality is not that high, it is lower, and the customers are then looking for substitutes. They're not satisfied with your products. They do not find value from your product. They do not find your product worth buying, right? And then they are looking outside for the other substitute products, such as teas, a substitute for coffee, right, or coffee for tea. Then fax machine overnight deliveries, right? Plastic container, then glass jars. All these products, we can see that they are giving at least equal value. The customer is perceiving at least equal value from these products, or he in some cases also perceives more value compared to the product he is already consuming. Then we have the intensity of rivalry from the competitors. Rivalry from the competitors can be very high when there are numerous competitors, and especially when the competitors are equal or when they are balanced competitors. For example, the large firms, there can be huge rivalry between the large firms, right? For example, Airbus and Boeing, the competitive battle keeps going between these two. Competitive rivalry can also be very high when the industry growth is very slow, and as a result the companies or the firms, they are trying to grab their market share. They're trying to retain their customers, and they're trying to grab their market share, and they're trying to their competitors may not take their customers and their market share. So as a result, there is competitive rivalry between the two competitors. Then again, when there are high fixed costs and the storage costs, and the firms, what they're doing to do is that they're producing in excess capacity to reduce their fixed costs, and as a result they are ready to sell their products in the market at lower prices so that their sales can also increase, right? And as a result, what happens is that it can invite the competitive rivalry when you're offering your products at very lower prices to attract the customers, right? In certain cases, the companies, they also give rebates. They also have the promotional policies such as buy one get one free, or this much off on the second product if you buy first one. That is because the companies are really producing in bulk, and they are then offering that at lower price to increase their sales, right? So that can also enhance, or that can also lead to competitive rivalry and the price wars, right? Then we have the perishable products that also lose value. As a result, you're offering them at lower prices, right? Again, if there is lack of differentiation, if you are not producing the differentiated product, and this means that you are competing on the basis of price, and that can again invite the rivalry and the price wars, such as what Dell and HP are doing. Then we have the exit barriers. Sometimes they are, even if the firms are producing at they are producing at losses, right? And as that is, their profitability is very low. They're producing at cut evens, right? And in those cases, the exit barriers, they need to produce, because the exit barriers, they might be very high, and it might be difficult for the firms to exit the industry. So there can be a number of cases where it happens, such as they have so specialized assets or specialized machinery that cannot be utilized anywhere else in any other business. Sometimes there can be government restrictions that if you exit the industry, it will lead to the increased unemployment, right? A large number of labor will become unemployed, right? It will be having its economic effects, right? To discourage those effects, the government sometimes imposes restrictions on the organizations, and sometimes there are fixed costs of exits, such as you have long-term labor agreements, right? And as a result of which you cannot exit. Then you have what are the implications for management of this industry analysis. We see that the external environment, the macro environment, it has its effects on the firm, right? But the effects are a little indirect. But the industry environment has very direct effects on the competitiveness of the organization, and the industry of the organization is directly dictating what will be the overall sales of the organization and what will be the profitability ratios and the profitability margins for the organization, right? And how it can survive in the industry. So the management, it really increasingly needs to ask itself the questions that which industries they should enter or which industries they should leave. What influence they can exert on the industry, and how the competitors are differently affected. So other key questions that the competitors or the management of a firm, they need to constantly ask themselves about their competitors is that what are their strengths, their weaknesses, their objectives and strategies, their responses to the external environment, their vulnerability to the external strategies, and what is our vulnerability to those strategic counterattacks, right? So if, for example, if your competitor is lowering his price, what would be your strategy? What will be your counter strategy, right? And if you adopt that counter strategy, how your competitor is again going to counter react to that, okay? Right? If, for example, if your competitor is reducing the price, you in retaliation also reduce the price. But what if he again reduces the price, right? So this kind of conditions that can lead to often happen in hyper environments or in the hyper competition, right? This is what happens. There is the price wars. This is how they start, and the situation of equilibrium is difficult to achieve. But you need to think strategically that how much do you afford to reduce your price? Do you have that much deep pockets to afford that lower and lower prices? Can you enter into the price wars? Because that can also be a strategy from your competitor to drive you out of the business by reducing the cost, by reducing the price, right? And then the other questions that you need to ask is that what is our product and service positioning, entry and exit of firms in the industry, key factors for our current position in the industry, sales, profit ranking of competitors over time, nature of supplier and distributor relationships, the threat of substitute products and services. We discussed all these points in our previous slides. So we need to really think very strategically, very analytically into all these points. What is your position vis-a-vis what is the position of your competitor? When it comes to your relationship with your suppliers and your distributors, you also need to see what are the relations and with the suppliers and the distributors of your competitors, right? So it is your position vis-a-vis the position of your competitor. It's not only your position or it's not only your competitor's position that you need to watch out. So here it's a very interesting cartoon. It says that what do you mean all my facts are wrong? I copied everything straight off the internet. So when we are scanning our environment, when we are gaining data, when we are gathering data from the external environment, we need to be very careful that about the authenticity of that information, about the authenticity of that data. There should not be information misload, and there should not be information overload that can really lead to very drastic outcomes for the organization. So we have the strategic groups, the direct competitors, which is the innermost layer that the organization has. So industry is where the one or more firms they are producing the similar products, but the competitors are where strategic groups is an example of the competitors, where the market segment is similar, where the geographic location is similar, where the technology is similar, whether it's leader or follower, where the size of the firms is similar and where the product range is similar. So they, on the number of areas, when the two firms are operating similarly on similar grounds on a number of areas, then it means that they're falling into the same strategic groups. Why it is important to have the understanding of your, so the two firms who are operating in the same strategic group, it means that they are direct competitors of each other. Whether if you are operating in, for example, the retailing industry, if you are the retailers, right? So a very, very big supermarket and if we make a comparison of a very big supermarket with a corner retailing shop, there are the corner shops, that corner retailing shop which are very small ones, right? If you compare them with a very, very big superstore in a very strategic location, they are operating in the same industry. They are in the retailing industry, right? Retailing consumer goods, right? And so they are in the same industry. They are having the same products, right? But they are not the direct competitors of each other. Another corner shop would be the direct competitor of that corner shop. Another very big superstore would be a direct competitor of that big superstore, right? So if you gather the information on the strategic decisions, if a corner shop, it tries to gather the information on the buyers and suppliers, the distribution channels of that very big superstore, if it tries to gather the information on that, then it might be misleading for that corner shop, right? Because that very big supermarket may have very different strategic customers. It may have very different strategic orientation, although it's dealing in the same products as this. They're into the same line of business. But the direct competitors of that corner store shop would be the other corner store shop as well, right? Because they are operating in the same geographic region. They're more or less the same technology, more or less the similar size. Market segments are the same, right? And that limited amount geographic location, right? And then similar product range. So market segment is basically a group of customers who have similar needs that are different from customers' needs in other parts of the market, right? So you need to understand that in which market segment you really need to target, which market segment you really want to target, right? So some customers, for example, they have the requirements for the consumer goods that are very cheap, very low price, right? Low quality and also low price, right? Which we also call the giffen goods. Some other customers, they want the products which are very high quality and which are very high priced as well, right? So these are the two different market segments. So the product quality is different for the two market segments, right? So the corner shop might be dealing with the products which are very cheap and which are for that market segment, which requires low priced goods, and the superstore, it might be having the products which are high quality and for the other market segment. So the management, the organization needs to identify who are its strategic customers and in which market segment it wants to operate. So with this, we finish our today's lecture. Today we really had a detailed discussion on how the external environment of an organization affects the organization. We discussed three layers that an organization faces. One is the external most layer, which is the macro environment. We've discussed it with the help of the pastoral framework. Then we had a discussion on the inner layer that the organization faces, which is the industry. So they are not the firms operating in the industry, they are not the direct competitors of the firm, but they can directly influence the profitability of the firm, right? And the firm needs to see what is its position vis-a-vis the position of the other firms in the industry. And we also saw the concept of the direct competitors, or the concept of so with the help of the strategic groups, that how we need to have a fair understanding of the strategic groups, because the firms in the strategic groups, they are the direct competitors of the firm and they have direct implications for the firm. So we discussed the management implications of these aspects, how the managers need to develop their strategies by analyzing, by forecasting and by constantly scanning the environment and making an analysis of the external environment vis-a-vis their own position. With this, we come to the end of this lecture, and our next lecture would be on the internal environment of the organizations. Thank you very much. I hope the lecture was really informative and useful and clear for you. See you again. Thank you very much. Allah Hafiz.